10 years old, and the police raided our home. I can still see the look of disgust on one young copper's face. It was like he hated me. And how he spoke to my mum, like she was dirt. I knew that Malcolm would have been treated in the same way, and that these were the attitudes that had broken up his family. On the 10th of May 1965, the Wentworth Court found that Malcolm and Robert were neglected children. They were ripped away from the peaceful life of the bush and sent to Kinchela Boys' Home at Kempsey, hundreds of miles away on the coast. Their family weren't told where they were and had no way of contacting them. Life was changing for these boys. They were now going into a world where rules and regulations replaced love and affection. All the boys were given numbers. Malcolm's number was 3. From going through Malcolm's files, I learnt that he spent 5 years being educated at Kinchela, and after that time, all that they could say about him was that he was fairly typical of the emotionally deprived adolescent. And then they cast him out with the words, "Taking into account Malcolm's lack of academic qualifications, it is difficult to be able to recommend anything for the future for him." But even now, they didn't let him go home. They just sent him to Sydney. It was 1969. He was 15 years old, innocent and illiterate. Malcolm was still a ward of the state, and everything he did was put in a report. I went back to the boarding house in Sydney where he'd been placed, just to get a feel for what it was like for him.
He must have had a tremendous sense of isolation. A young person from the southwestern part of the state, reefed away from his family at probably the most important stage of his development, taken up miles and miles, hundreds of miles away and placed at Kempsey, then worst of all, transferred from Kempsey to the urban environment of Sydney and expected to exist almost alone. I mean, you can see a tremendous process of isolation.
Back in my office, I read about Malcolm's Sydney days. I saw that in June 1970, he was put on probation for trying to steal a pedal for his push bike. And then his job was changed, and he was put in an office. Not being able to read and write, he hated this, and he started to turn up late. This merely fulfilled their low expectations, and he was sacked. Losing his job put him in breach of his probation, and he was committed to the notorious Mount Penang Training Centre for an indefinite period.
There would have been probably between 30 and 40% of the young people there Aboriginals. Many of them were there for the most minor offences, and some of them not even there for criminal offences. They were there for welfare offences, really, if you can call them that, being uncontrollable, being neglected. There was a Saturday morning digging which was called crow shooting, when the whole institution, everybody in the institution, was issued with a shovel or a pick, and they went out onto the huge paddocks at Mount Penang and they just dug in long rows, interminable digging. And it was for no reason. We weren't planting anything. It was just turning over the soil, and it was just a means of occupying people for the whole of a Saturday morning. Minor offences were punished by young people being placed on a thing called the holy stone, which was a piece of sandstone, and they were made to move it backwards and forwards. Historically, it came from scrubbing the decks, and much of Mount Penang was about occupying time. It was not about education, it was not about training, it was about occupying time and maintaining control.
Everything that I read was negative. In July 1970, the superintendent of Mount Penang dismissed Malcolm in his report with the words, "A state ward of dull intelligence. His initial response to training was not very acceptable, and he was placed in the craft school in an attempt to overcome his illiteracy." During his time at Mount Penang, half-hearted attempts were made to contact his family. They hadn't moved very far, so it can't have been hard to find them. But even so, I read a report stating that they were unable to locate any family address to which the lad could be sent. And then there was another report stating that the family had been found but were unsuitable. And finally, a third one. A third one that didn't seem to care whether he had a family or not. Placement, it said, is not required with the father because Mrs. Plater will take Malcolm.
But I felt that he was quite a bright boy, and he certainly wasn't a fellow of very poor intellect. He was just an ordinary kid that lived a very extraordinary sort of life. And I was really very worried that when I found out that he couldn't read or write, of course, because I learnt nothing through going through Kinchler and Penang, I'd say. That's taught them absolutely nothing. No way of living at all. But when they come out to an unstable and not knowing how to cope with this big bad world here, that it's just hopeless. What we should have done was try and find his parents, because I should never have had him anyway.
Why do you think he was stealing things?
Just against society, I think. Malcolm was about 17, and he was just showing the world what he can do.
The things Malcolm stole were pretty insignificant. In court, they didn't give him a lawyer. And even though his father was alive and well, the court told him that both his parents were dead. He was committed for 2 years and ended up at the institution for boys at Tamworth.
The institution at Tamworth was an unbelievable place. They lived in cells, they spent long periods of the day in silence. In fact, you could only speak for 10 minutes in the morning and 10 minutes in the afternoon, and that was not a right, it was a privilege that had to be earned. They were not allowed to speak at any other time unless they were questioned by a staff member. If they wanted to speak to a staff member, they used to have to come to attention and no closer than 6 feet to the staff member and look at their feet while they were speaking to them. They were not allowed to speak at any other time. They had to seek permission to blow their nose. In fact, they had to seek permission to take their handkerchief out of their pocket and then seek permission to blow their nose.
Well, I was there in the real hard days, right? You used to get flogged every day as soon as you went there. You got doled for any little thing at all. You'd look at someone, you'd brush someone or something like that. They used to take you down to the grill and belt you. They used to give you a little steel bar and you'd have to scrape it up and down the bar so they could hear it down the office all day long. Your hands got that tired from just scraping this little bar, you just drop it out of your hand. And every time you stopped, you got belted.
And lights were out at 7 o'clock. And they stayed in those cells alone and in silence till the next morning. To lie in such isolation for such long periods of time, I can only believe, had a detrimental effect on people's lives.
You can't afford to be an emotional person, feel sorry for yourself because you're there, because there's nothing you can do about it. And then over a period of time, I think you suppress your natural emotions to the point where you've got no emotions and you can't relate to people outside that environment that you're in. And you don't want it because it can be your downfall if you do.
Oh, it just made you harder and harder. Not everyone that I know went there ended up with big jail sentences, life laggings and everything out of it.
In my experience, many young people who lose track of their families and become socially isolated lose motivation. There's nothing for them to work towards, and many of them become helpless. And I think that that's probably why Malcolm was described as being lacking in motivation, aimless, all those sorts of things. And it was quite remarkable, I think, in Malcolm's story that when he found out that his father was alive, his attitude started to change. Incentive returned, and he started to make progress.
Between the ages of 11 and 19, Malcolm had been out of institutions for a total of only 9 months. His dream of going home was about to come true, but it wasn't going to be easy.
When he came back, he just went around meeting everybody and his cousins, and he wanted to know his family, you know, he wanted to know everyone.
He was this big, strong, you know, tough guy that was soft with us kids, and he was there, he was going to look after us. He was trying to spend as much time as he could with the family, and that's only natural for someone to catch up, time with his family.
When you first get out, it's a good feeling. There's nothing like it. It's just at a high that nothing can explain. But then after a while, the reality of it sets in after a month or 2 months, and that's it, and that's where you're caught. It's like you're standing on the edge, and you'd want to go up and you want to cuddle your family and hold them and say that you love them. But because you've suppressed that emotions for so long, that you find it very difficult to express yourself in the way that you would with your family. And so that's what alienates you further, because they think, you know, oh, he's a cold person, he's turned into a cold person, and he, you know, you're strange, you're different.
When they come back, then they try to be the same as it was before, but it can't be, you know. Everybody tries, but it's just not the same anymore.
It's affected my whole life. Still think about it.